Program your brain to do hard things, even without motivation. This book is not designed to motivate you. If you are looking for energy, inspiration, or emotional momentum, this audiobook will feel cold. That is intentional. Motivation is unstable. Anything that depends on it eventually collapses. This book exists to remove that dependency entirely. By the time you reach the end, you will not feel like a different person. You will understand why certain behaviors have become unavoidable and why others quietly disappeared without effort. The benefit of this book is not a feeling. It is a structural change in how action occurs. Most people believe the problem is that they do not want things badly enough. That belief is false. Wanting is not a mechanism. Desire does not move behavior reliably. If it did, information alone would be enough to change lives. The real issue is simpler and more uncomfortable. You are operating from an identity that predicts non-execution under specific conditions. Your brain is doing exactly what it is designed to do. Preserve consistency. When behavior violates identity, resistance appears. That resistance is not weakness, it is correction. Motivation fails as a strategy because it is state-dependent. It fluctuates with sleep, stress, and emotion. Any plan that requires motivation is temporary by definition. Behavior does not change when emotion rises. Behavior changes when identity expectations shift. This book operates at that level. If you listen to this book to the end and apply what is described, action will stop requiring internal permission. You will act without debating or waiting for the right mood. Resistance will still appear, but it will no longer decide. Consistency will become mechanical rather than emotional. This book does not rely on positive thinking, visualization, or belief. It relies on one assumption only. Action is the only interface with reality. Thoughts do not change identity. Understanding does not change identity. Only repeated action does. At the end of this book, you should not feel inspired. You should feel something quieter and more dangerous. Certainty. Not certainty about outcomes, but certainty about execution. When execution becomes reliable, outcomes stop being goals. They become consequences. This is the shift you are about to make. Chapter 1. Motivation is a symptom, not a tool. Motivation is commonly treated as the fuel of action. People assume that if they could just access more of it, consistency would follow. This assumption is wrong at the causal level. Motivation is not an input, it is a readout. It appears after the system is already moving. When people say, "I can't get myself to do it," what they mean is not that motivation is missing. What they mean is that their identity does not predict execution under current conditions. The brain is conserving energy by maintaining behavioral consistency. From the brain's perspective, this is success, not failure. Motivation arises when action aligns with identity and environment. It disappears when either changes. This is why motivation spikes at the beginning of new projects and collapses shortly after. Novelty temporarily suspends identity prediction. Once novelty fades, the system reasserts itself. This explains a common pattern. People wait to feel motivated before acting. Sometimes that feeling arrives, usually under low stress or high novelty. Action follows briefly. Then conditions change. Fatigue, boredom, or friction appear. Motivation drops. Action stops. The conclusion drawn is incorrect. People assume they lost motivation, when in reality they lost permission from their identity. Motivation never failed them. It was never responsible. Treating motivation as a tool creates a fragile system. It places execution at the mercy of internal states that fluctuate constantly. Sleep, blood sugar, mood, weather, social feedback, and uncertainty all modulate motivation. A system built on such variables cannot be stable. This is why advice focused on increasing motivation produces cycles instead of progress. You get energized, start strong, then stop. Each cycle reinforces the belief that you are inconsistent, which strengthens the very identity that resists effort. The system learns that motivation is required, and absence of motivation becomes a legitimate reason not to act. From a neurological perspective, motivation is a reward signal. It follows perceived progress and identity alignment. It does not initiate behavior reliably. Expecting it to do so is like waiting for muscle soreness before going to the gym. The signal comes after the work, not before. People who appear highly disciplined are often misunderstood. They are not acting because they are motivated. They are motivated because they are acting in a way that confirms who they believe they are. Their execution precedes their emotional state. The emotion is a byproduct. This distinction matters because it changes where intervention must occur. If motivation is a symptom, then increasing it treats the output, not the cause. Any gain achieved that way is temporary. The system always returns to baseline. The correct question is not, how do I get motivated? The correct question is, what conditions cause motivation to appear without being required? The answer is consistent action that aligns with identity. Once that loop is in place, motivation becomes redundant. Removing motivation from the decision process feels dangerous at first. People fear that without it, they will do nothing. The opposite is true. Dependence on motivation is what creates paralysis. When motivation is no longer consulted, action becomes simpler, not harder. This chapter establishes a critical rule that governs everything that follows. You do not need motivation to act. You need a system that acts without asking how it feels. Until this distinction is understood, every attempt at self-change will remain fragile. In the next chapter, we will map the actual causal chain that governs human behavior, not preferences, not intentions. The real sequence that determines what you do, what you avoid, and why outcomes repeat even when you know better. Chapter 2. The real causal chain of human behavior. Human behavior feels chaotic from the inside, but it is mechanically consistent from the outside. People repeat patterns not because they choose to, but because those patterns are the natural output of a stable internal system. Until that system is understood, change attempts target symptoms and decay over time. Most models of behavior are upside down. They assume that thoughts create actions and that better thinking produces better results. This assumption is comforting because it implies control through insight. It is also false. Thoughts are not primary drivers. They are surface-level justifications generated after deeper processes have already set direction. The real causal chain runs in a fixed order, whether you acknowledge it or not. Identity comes first. Identity is not a self-description or a personality label. It is a set of emotionally reinforced expectations about how you behave under specific conditions. Identity answers one question only. What does someone like me do in this situation? From identity emerges an emotional baseline. This is not emotion as reaction, but emotion as background. Certain actions feel heavy, threatening, or unnatural. Others feel neutral or obvious. This baseline is not chosen. It is predicted. From that emotional baseline arise automatic thoughts. These thoughts feel like reasoning, but they are downstream rationalizations. I'll do it later. Now isn't ideal. I work better when I'm in the right mood. These thoughts are not causes. They are translators converting emotional resistance into language. Actions follow, not heroic actions or dramatic efforts, but repeated patterns of doing or avoiding. What you consistently do is not a reflection of your goals. It is a reflection of your identity under real conditions. Results then appear. These results are predictable, not because the world is unfair, but because inputs are stable. Finally, results feed back into identity. Each outcome becomes evidence. Evidence strengthens belief. Belief sharpens future prediction. The loop closes. Identity creates emotion. Emotion shapes thought. Thought permits or blocks action. Action produces results. Results reinforce identity. This loop is self-sealing. This explains why insight alone does nothing. You can understand what to do perfectly and still fail to do it. Understanding lives at the thought level. The system is governed above it. It also explains why emotional states feel so decisive. When emotion shifts, thoughts shift with it. People mistake this for free will. In reality, the system is just recalculating predictions based on internal conditions. Most behavior change attempts intervene too low. People try to adjust thoughts, hype emotions, or force actions. These interventions work briefly because they apply pressure, but pressure without identity alignment always leaks. As soon as the pressure is removed, the system reverts. This is not because you are weak. It is because the brain prioritizes predictability over improvement. Predictability reduces energy expenditure. Identity is the brain's compression algorithm. When you try to act against identity, the brain generates resistance to restore the expected pattern. That resistance can appear as fear, boredom, distraction, doubt, fatigue, or sudden loss of interest. Different sensations, same function. The critical implication is this: action alone does not change identity. Only repeated action that contradicts identity does. One-off effort is dismissed as anomaly. The system waits. When repetition occurs without collapse, prediction updates. This is why motivation spikes do not work. They produce action that is emotionally explained away. I did that because I was motivated. Identity remains intact. No contradiction is registered. To change the loop, intervention must occur at the identity level. But identity cannot be argued with or convinced. It can only be outdated by evidence. This is where most people fail. They try to jump directly to big actions in hopes of forcing identity change. The system interprets this as threat, increases resistance, and eventually wins. The old identity survives, now reinforced by another failure. The correct approach is quieter and slower. It introduces actions small enough to bypass resistance, but consistent enough to accumulate evidence. Over time, the emotional baseline shifts. Thoughts change automatically. Action becomes easier not because you are trying harder, but because the system predicts differently. This chapter establishes the architecture. Nothing in the following chapters will contradict it. Every protocol you hear will target one purpose only: altering identity prediction through controlled evidence. In the next chapter, we will isolate identity itself, not as a concept, but as a functional prediction engine. You will see why your brain resists change even when change would objectively improve your life, and why that resistance is not a flaw, but a feature that must be redirected rather than fought. Chapter 3: Identity is a prediction engine. Identity is not who you think you are. It is who your brain predicts you will be. This distinction matters because prediction, not intention, governs behavior. Your brain is not designed to help you become better. It is designed to help you remain consistent. Consistency reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty consumes energy. Identity exists to minimize that cost. Most people assume identity is formed by beliefs, values, or self-concept. Those are secondary. Identity is built from behavioral evidence under real conditions. What you do when tired, bored, uncertain, or unsupervised is what the system records. Everything else is discounted. Your brain aggregates this data and builds a model. That model answers one question automatically, without words. What does someone like me do next? That answer is delivered as a feeling. If the predicted action matches identity, the feeling is neutral or light. If it contradicts identity, the feeling is heavy. That heaviness is resistance. It is not emotional weakness, it is prediction enforcement. This is why people feel friction before they even start. The brain is not reacting to the task. It is reacting to a forecast violation. When you say, "I don't feel like it," what you are actually experiencing is the brain signaling that the proposed action does not align with its current model of you. The sensation feels subjective, but the process is mechanical. Identity predicts effort tolerance, persistence, follow-through, and recovery. It predicts whether you stop when things get uncomfortable or continue without drama. It predicts whether you negotiate with yourself or execute automatically. Importantly, identity is contextual. The brain does not hold one global prediction. It holds many. This is why someone can be disciplined at work and avoidant in health, or consistent under deadlines and unreliable without them. Different contexts, different identity models. This is also why people mistake external pressure for discipline. Under pressure, the context changes. The prediction changes with it. Remove the pressure and behavior reverts. Identity was never updated. Attempts to change behavior through self-talk fail because identity does not process language as evidence. Saying, "I am disciplined," provides no usable data. Thinking, "This time will be different," produces no prediction error. The system waits. Identity only updates when prediction fails without external explanation. This is a critical point. If you act differently but can attribute that action to motivation, urgency, fear, novelty, or supervision, identity remains unchanged. The brain explains the anomaly away. "I only did that because I felt motivated. I only did that because I had to. I only did that because it was new." No update occurs. For identity to shift, the brain must be forced to conclude, "This happened without special circumstances." That requires repetition. One contradiction is ignored. A few are labeled exceptions. Many, under stable conditions, force recalibration. This is why large, dramatic efforts are counterproductive. They generate too much emotional explanation. When they fail, they confirm the old model. When they succeed briefly, they are dismissed as temporary states. Identity becomes more rigid after each failed overhaul attempt. The system learns that deviation is costly and unstable. The correct strategy is the opposite of what most people attempt. Instead of trying to prove a new identity through intensity, you introduce small, boring, repeatable actions that quietly violate prediction. The threat level stays low, resistance is muted, but the data accumulates. Over time, the brain updates its forecast. Emotional weight decreases. Thoughts change without effort. Action stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like the obvious next step. This is why identity change feels anticlimactic. When done correctly, there is no breakthrough moment, no surge of confidence, just a gradual disappearance of friction. People often misinterpret this phase. They think the action isn't working because it feels unimpressive. In reality, the system is recalibrating beneath awareness. Once identity shifts, motivation appears as a side effect. People then falsely credit motivation for the change. In truth, motivation arrived because it was no longer needed. The practical implication is unavoidable. If you try to act in ways that require a new identity before installing it, you will experience resistance and collapse. If you install the identity first through evidence, action becomes inevitable. Identity is not changed by desire. It is not changed by insight. It is not changed by force. It is changed by prediction failure at scale. Everything in the next chapters is built on this principle. We will not ask how to overcome resistance. We will ask how to use it, because resistance only appears when identity is being challenged in the correct direction. In the next chapter, we will examine resistance directly. You will see why fear, procrastination, boredom, and doubt are not obstacles to progress, but precise signals pointing to the exact actions required for identity change, and how misinterpreting them keeps people trapped in the same loop indefinitely. Chapter 4. Resistance is Identity Self-Preservation. Most people treat resistance as an enemy. They experience hesitation, doubt, boredom, fear, or fatigue, and assume something has gone wrong. They believe resistance means they are incapable, unprepared, or broken. That interpretation is incorrect at the system level. Resistance is not opposition to growth. Resistance is protection of identity. Once you understand this, resistance stops being something to eliminate and becomes something to read. The brain's primary objective is not progress. It is stability. Identity provides that stability by predicting behavior and emotional cost. When you attempt an action that violates that prediction, the system intervenes to restore equilibrium. Resistance is that intervention. This is why resistance appears before action, not after. The brain is not responding to failure. It is preventing prediction error in advance. The form resistance takes is irrelevant. The function is consistent. Fear signals potential loss of control. Boredom signals lack of novelty-based justification. Doubt signals insufficient certainty to explain deviation. Fatigue signals anticipated energy expenditure. Procrastination signals delay as risk mitigation. Different sensations, same purpose. Stop behavior that contradicts identity. This is also why resistance feels personal. It uses internal language. The brain does not say identity preservation in progress. It says, this doesn't feel right. Now isn't the time, or you'll do it later. The system translates threat into familiar thoughts, so that compliance feels voluntary. Most people make the same mistake at this point. They argue with resistance. They try to overpower it with logic, emotion, or force. This creates an escalation. When you fight resistance directly, the brain interprets that as increased threat. Threat amplifies resistance. The system is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Other people retreat. They treat resistance as a stop signal. This is even worse. Retreat confirms the identity prediction. The system records deviation avoided, model accurate. Resistance increases next time. Both strategies strengthen the old identity. The correct response is neither fight nor retreat. It is interpretation followed by constrained action. Resistance must be read correctly. Here is the rule. Resistance only appears when you are pointed at an action that would change identity. You do not feel resistance toward behaviors that already match who you believe you are. You do not negotiate brushing your teeth. You do not debate checking your phone. These actions sit inside identity. They require no permission. Resistance marks the boundary of identity. This is why people often feel the strongest resistance toward the actions that would help them most. Those actions threaten the current prediction model. The system reacts proportionally. Once you see resistance this way, avoidance stops making sense. Avoiding resistance is equivalent to protecting the exact identity you want to outgrow. However, charging directly into resistance also fails, because it triggers a threat response too large for the system to tolerate. This is where most self-improvement advice collapses. It either tells you to push through or to listen to yourself. Both are identity-preserving strategies. The correct move is smaller. Instead of asking, how do I get rid of resistance? The correct question is, how do I act without requiring resistance to disappear? This is a critical shift. Resistance is not a gate that must open. It is a background signal that must be ignored procedurally. The action must be designed so that resistance is irrelevant to execution. This is why size matters more than intensity. Large actions amplify resistance because they demand explanation. The brain asks, why is this happening? If no stable reason exists, the system blocks it. Small actions require no explanation. They slide under the prediction threshold. This is not about tricking yourself. It is about respecting how the system works. When you take a small action in the presence of resistance, something important happens. The brain registers a prediction error that it cannot easily explain away. There was no motivation spike, no pressure, no urgency. The action still occurred. One instance is ignored. Repetition is not. Over time, resistance weakens not because it was defeated, but because the prediction that generated it is no longer accurate. The system updates. What once required resistance no longer does. This is why resistance disappears after identity changes, never before. People often wait for resistance to go away before acting. That is equivalent to waiting for identity to change before providing evidence. It never happens. Action must precede relief. There is another important implication. If you feel no resistance toward an action you believe is important, that action is unlikely to change your identity. It may produce results, but it will not reprogram who you are. Comfort is a sign of alignment, not growth. Resistance, therefore, is directional data. It tells you where identity edges are located. Used correctly, it points directly to leverage. Used incorrectly, it becomes a lifelong excuse. The practical rule is precise. When resistance appears, do not escalate. Do not retreat. Reduce the action until execution becomes inevitable. Then execute without commentary. No evaluation, no emotion processing, just completion. You are not trying to feel better. You are trying to generate evidence. Each time you act while resistance is present, identity weakens slightly. Each time you avoid action because resistance is present, identity hardens. This is why people who label themselves as anxious, unmotivated, or inconsistent remain so. They have learned to obey resistance. The system rewards obedience with temporary relief. Relief reinforces the pattern. Breaking this loop does not require courage. It requires design. You design actions so small, so bounded, and so repeatable that resistance becomes irrelevant to outcome. Over time, the system learns a new rule. Resistance no longer predicts non-action. When that happens, resistance loses its function. It fades. This chapter removes the need to conquer internal states. You do not need to feel brave. You do not need to feel ready. You do not need to feel confident. You need to understand that resistance is not a stop sign. It is a compass. In the next chapter, we will examine why willpower fails even when resistance is understood, and why relying on effort as an override mechanism creates cycles of collapse. You will see why sustainable execution requires removing force entirely and replacing it with structure. Chapter 5. Why willpower always loses. Willpower is commonly treated as a virtue. People admire it, praise it, and attempt to cultivate it. In reality, willpower is not a solution. It is an emergency override. Systems that depend on it are unstable by design. Willpower is what happens when identity and action are misaligned and you attempt to force behavior anyway. It is the brain temporarily overriding its own prediction model. This is metabolically expensive and neurologically unsustainable. Every time you use willpower, you are fighting the system instead of redesigning it. This is why willpower feels effortful. The brain is allocating extra energy to suppress resistance signals. That energy is finite. When it runs out, the system snaps back to baseline. The old identity reasserts itself, often with greater force. This creates a familiar cycle. A person decides to get serious, they push hard, they exert effort, they feel proud of their discipline. For a while, behavior changes, then stress increases, novelty fades, or life disrupts the routine. Willpower depletes, execution collapses. The person concludes they lack discipline. The conclusion is wrong. The method was flawed. Willpower does not change identity, it temporarily overrides it. From the brain's perspective, this is noise. When the override ends, the original prediction model remains intact. In fact, repeated reliance on willpower strengthens the old identity. Each collapse teaches the system that deviation is short-lived and costly. The brain learns that waiting out effort restores normalcy. Resistance increases next time. This is why people who pride themselves on willpower often experience the most dramatic burnout. They operate in constant opposition to their own prediction system. That conflict cannot be sustained indefinitely. Another critical limitation of willpower is that it only works under controlled conditions. It fails under stress, fatigue, boredom, uncertainty, and emotional load. Unfortunately, those are the exact conditions under which consistent action matters most. A system that only functions when life is calm is not a real system. It is a performance. This explains why people can be consistent during challenges, programs, or supervised environments, then regress immediately afterward. External structure temporarily replaces identity. Once removed, behavior reverts. Willpower also distorts feedback. When you force yourself to act, the brain explains the behavior as externally caused. I did that because I pushed myself. Identity remains unchanged. No internal evidence is generated. For identity to update, action must occur without force. It must feel self-authored. This is why effortless repetition changes identity faster than heroic effort. The dangerous illusion of willpower is that it feels productive. Effort creates a sense of progress, even when the system is unchanged. People confuse exhaustion with effectiveness, but effort is not leverage. Leverage is achieved when behavior occurs without resistance being overridden. When the system predicts action and no longer fights it, execution becomes stable. This does not mean you never exert effort. It means effort is not the mechanism of change. Structure is. The correct approach is not to strengthen willpower, but to design environments and actions that do not require it. This is an engineering problem, not a moral one. When actions are small, bounded, and repeatable, willpower becomes unnecessary. When identity aligns with execution, effort disappears. This is why the most consistent people appear calm. They are not constantly pushing themselves. They are following systems that make action the path of least resistance. Understanding this reframes failure. If you collapse under stress, it is not because you are weak. It is because you relied on an override mechanism instead of changing the underlying prediction. This chapter removes willpower from the equation entirely. You do not need more strength, you need less opposition. In the next chapter, we will define the smallest identity shift required to change behavior permanently, not a complete reinvention, but a minimal adjustment that alters prediction enough to remove the need for willpower altogether. Muito curto, Chapter 6, The Minimum Viable Identity Shift. Most people approach change as if identity were a destination. They believe they must become someone else before their behavior can stabilize. This assumption guarantees failure because the brain treats large identity shifts as existential threats. Identity is not upgraded in chunks. It is adjusted in increments. The system does not ask, "Who am I becoming?" It asks, "What reliably happens next?" This is why attempting to adopt identities like disciplined, consistent, confident, productive, or focused triggers immediate resistance. These labels imply a broad redefinition of self. The brain cannot validate them with existing data, so it rejects them. Identity change only works when the shift is small enough to be believable, yet specific enough to alter prediction. The minimum viable identity shift is not about excellence, success, or outcomes. It is about decision criteria. Most people unknowingly operate under this rule. I act when my internal state is favorable. This rule explains everything. It explains inconsistency, procrastination, reliance on pressure, bursts of effort followed by collapse, and the constant search for motivation. The brain predicts non-action whenever the state is unfavorable, and it is usually correct. Trying to override this rule with willpower fails because the rule itself remains intact. The smallest identity shift that breaks this loop is replacing that rule with a new one. I act regardless of internal state. This is not a motivational statement, it is a mechanical one. It does not claim that action is easy, enjoyable, or effective. It claims only that emotion is removed from the decision process. This single shift alters the system at its root. Once internal state is no longer a gating condition, the brain stops checking for permission before initiating action. Resistance may still appear, but it no longer has veto power. This works precisely because it is minimal. The brain does not resist this rule the way it resists aspirational identities. Why? Because it does not threaten status, safety, or coherence. It does not say you are better than before. It says the procedure has changed. Procedural identity changes are tolerated. Evaluative identity changes are attacked. This distinction is critical. When people try to become disciplined, they are making an evaluative claim. The brain responds by demanding proof. That proof requires sustained effort. Sustained effort requires willpower. Willpower collapses, the identity claim fails. The old model is reinforced. When people adopt the procedural rule of acting regardless of state, the brain does not demand dramatic proof. Small evidence is sufficient. This is why the identity shift must be paired with appropriately small actions. If the action is too large, the brain explains it away. If it is too small but repeated, it becomes undeniable. Identity does not update through declarations. It updates through unexplained repetition. This is where most people misunderstand identity work. They think they must feel different to be different. In reality, feeling different is a lagging indicator. At first, acting regardless of internal state feels wrong. It feels forced, artificial, or pointless. That sensation is expected. It is the old prediction model being violated. Importantly, the new identity is not installed by one action or even 10. The brain discounts anomalies. It looks for patterns. If action occurs occasionally without motivation, the system explains it as a fluke. If action occurs frequently without motivation, the system recalibrates. This is why consistency matters more than difficulty. A small action repeated daily carries more identity-shifting power than a large action performed sporadically. The system updates based on frequency, not intensity. Another common error is trying to stack multiple identity shifts at once. People attempt to change diet, training, work, sleep, and learning simultaneously. This overwhelms the prediction system. Resistance multiplies, collapse follows. Identity can only update in one dimension at a time. The minimum viable identity shift must be narrow. One rule, one behavior, one domain. Once the system accepts that action can occur without favorable internal conditions, scaling becomes possible. Before that, any increase in difficulty will trigger regression. It is also important to understand what this identity shift does not do. It does not make you more motivated. It does not make action pleasurable. It does not eliminate negative emotion. What it does is remove emotion from the role of decision maker. Emotion remains a passenger. Identity becomes the driver. This is why people who operate from this identity often appear emotionally neutral. They are not suppressing feelings. They are simply not consulting them. This neutrality is not apathy. It is efficiency. Once the brain predicts that action happens regardless of state, The emotional cost of action decreases. Resistance weakens. Thoughts simplify. What once required effort becomes routine. This is how motivation eventually reappears, not as fuel, but as confirmation. People then misattribute the change. They say they became motivated. In reality, motivation arrived because the system no longer needed to prevent action. This chapter defines the identity target precisely so that the next step can be engineered correctly. In the next chapter, we will move from identity to execution. We will design actions that are small enough to bypass resistance, structured enough to ensure repetition, and constrained enough that failure becomes statistically irrelevant. This is where inevitability begins to replace effort. Chapter 7. Designing Actions That Cannot Be Resisted. Once the identity rule is defined, execution becomes an engineering problem. The question is no longer whether you should act, but how to design actions that the system cannot block. Most people fail here because they confuse meaningful with large. They assume that if an action matters, it must feel significant. This assumption is incorrect. Significance is measured by evidence accumulation, not by perceived effort. The brain does not evaluate actions by importance. It evaluates them by threat. Large actions trigger explanation requirements. The brain asks why this is happening, what it will cost, and whether it should be allowed. If the answers are unclear, resistance appears. Negotiation begins. Collapse follows. Small actions avoid this entirely. An action becomes inevitable when it sits below the resistance threshold. That threshold is not moral. It is neurological. It represents the point at which the brain decides an action is too costly or identity-threatening to permit without justification. The goal is not to push through that threshold. The goal is to operate beneath it. This requires precision. An action that is too small but irregular produces no pattern. An action that is too large produces resistance. An action that is small and frequent rewrites prediction. The correct size is the smallest unit of action that can be performed even on the worst day without internal negotiation. If you have to convince yourself the action is too large, this is where most people overestimate themselves. They design actions for ideal days and expect them to survive real ones. The system does not care about ideal conditions. It predicts behavior under average and adverse conditions. Design for those. Another common mistake is leaving actions open-ended. Work on project, exercise, or study are not actions. They are categories. Categories invite evaluation. Evaluation invites emotion. Emotion invites negotiation. Actions must be bounded. Bounded actions have clear start and end points. They are measured in time or quantity, not quality. 20 minutes, 1 page, 5 repetitions, or 1 paragraph are executable. The brain does not need to assess them. It only needs to allow them. Timing also matters. Variable timing creates daily decision points. Decision points are where resistance enters. Fixed timing removes the question entirely. The action is not chosen. It is scheduled. The system learns sequence. After a trigger, the action occurs. No emotional check is required. This is how automaticity begins. Another critical design element is closure. Actions must end deliberately, even if they feel incomplete. Stopping on time trains the brain that execution is safe and finite. Overrunning increases perceived cost and triggers future resistance. Ending while energy remains is not a lack of discipline. It is a structural requirement for repetition. This is why many people sabotage themselves by doing extra on good days. The system records the increased cost. The next day, resistance increases. Consistency breaks. The objective is not to maximize output per day. It is to maximize number of days executed. When actions are designed correctly, Willpower is unnecessary. Resistance may appear, but it has nothing to argue with. The action is too small to justify refusal and too defined to negotiate. This creates a powerful feedback loop. Execution occurs. The brain notes that action happened without motivation. Prediction shifts slightly. Emotional weight decreases. Execution becomes easier. This is inevitability in practice. Design also requires exclusion. You must decide in advance what does not count. No substitutions, no upgrades, no making up for yesterday. Variability destroys pattern recognition. Identity updates only when the system detects the same action occurring under the same conditions repeatedly. This chapter reframes execution. You are not trying to be productive. You are trying to be predictable. Predictability is what the brain rewards. In the next chapter, we will examine why time, not intensity, is the real driver of neurological change. You will see why boring consistency reshapes identity faster than emotional effort, and how patience becomes a mechanical advantage rather than a virtue. Chapter 8, Time, Not Intensity, rewrites the brain. Human beings systematically overvalue intensity and undervalue time. This bias explains why people attempt dramatic changes and abandon them just as predictably. Intensity feels effective because it produces immediate sensation. Time feels passive because its effects are delayed. The brain does not change through peaks. It changes through exposure. Neurological adaptation is a function of repetition under stable conditions. The system tracks frequency, not effort. This is why extreme effort followed by long gaps produces no lasting change, while modest effort applied consistently reshapes behavior. Identity does not ask how hard something was. It asks how often it happened. When an action occurs repeatedly, the brain updates its prediction model. Emotional response adjusts. Cognitive load decreases. What once required attention becomes background process. This is not habit in the popular sense. It is recalibration. Intensity interferes with this process. High-intensity effort generates emotional explanations. The brain attributes the action to special circumstances. I did that because I was fired up. I did that because I had time. I did that because I was under pressure. These explanations prevent identity update. The action is classified as conditional. Time removes explanation. When an action occurs every day, regardless of mood, energy, or circumstance, the brain runs out of stories. Prediction must update. The system concludes that this behavior is part of who you are. This is why boredom is not a problem. It is a feature. Boredom signals that novelty has worn off and emotional stimulation is gone. When action continues anyway, the system is forced to accept that emotion is not the driver. This accelerates identity change. People often quit during boredom because they believe boredom means the method has stopped working. In reality, boredom indicates that the method is now working at the identity level. Another misunderstanding is impatience. People expect internal change to be noticeable. They look for confidence, clarity, or enthusiasm as signs of progress. These are lagging indicators. The brain updates quietly. At first, nothing feels different. Resistance still appears. Emotion still fluctuates. This leads people to escalate intensity or abandon the process. Both destroy the effect of time. Time only works when the signal remains clean. A clean signal means the same action, at the same size, under the same conditions, repeated without emotional amplification. This is why consistency beats enthusiasm. Enthusiasm contaminates the signal. It adds explanation. It delays identity update. Another important factor is stress. High stress reduces neurological plasticity. Under threat, the brain prioritizes preservation, not learning. This is why forcing intensity during stressful periods backfires. The system locks in old patterns. Low to moderate stress combined with repetition produces the fastest change. This is another reason actions must be small. Small actions keep the nervous system out of threat mode. Time also explains why breaks are dangerous early on. Interruptions reset prediction accumulation. The system forgets quickly until a pattern is well established. Once identity shifts, breaks become less harmful. Before that, they are expensive. People often ask how long this takes. The question itself reflects outcome focus. The system does not change at a fixed rate. It changes when enough evidence accumulates to justify a new prediction. For most people, this occurs somewhere between 30 and 90 repetitions. Not consecutive days of perfection, but repeated executions without explanation. This is why almost every day is not enough. Gaps provide explanation. The brain maintains the old model. The goal is not to feel better over time. The goal is to make the system certain. Certainty is built through repetition that survives boredom, fatigue, and doubt. Once certainty is installed, motivation often returns. People then believe the motivation caused the change. In reality, it arrived because it was no longer needed. Time is not patience. It is pressure applied quietly. In the next chapter, we will formalize this process into an evidence engine. You will see exactly how actions become proof, how belief changes without conscious effort, and how to structure repetition so that identity update becomes unavoidable. Chapter 9. The Evidence Engine. Beliefs do not change through thinking, they change through evidence. This sounds obvious, yet most people behave as if belief is something that can be reasoned into place. They attempt to convince themselves they are disciplined, capable, or consistent. The brain does not accept arguments about identity. It accepts data. The function of the evidence engine is simple. Convert repeated action into identity change. Every time you act, the brain records 3 variables: whether the action occurred, under what conditions it occurred, and whether it required explanation. These variables determine whether the action is incorporated into identity or dismissed as anomaly. Most actions fail to change belief because they are explainable. They happen during motivation spikes, under pressure, or in ideal circumstances. The brain tags them as conditional. Identity remains unchanged. For evidence to matter, action must occur when it should not have occurred according to the old prediction model. That is what creates contradiction. Contradiction is the raw material of belief change. However, contradiction must be repeated. Single instances are discounted. The brain protects identity by treating them as noise. Only sustained contradiction forces model update. This is where structure matters. The evidence engine requires actions that are consistent in size, timing, and constraint. Variability introduces explanation. Explanation prevents identity update. When the same action happens every day at the same time, regardless of internal state, the brain loses its ability to attribute it to circumstance. The only remaining explanation is identity. This is how belief shifts without conscious effort. Another critical element is emotional binding. Evidence must be emotionally registered, not intense, but noticed. If you rush through action without awareness, the system may not log it fully. This does not mean reflection or self-congratulation. It means a brief acknowledgement that action occurred despite resistance. A simple internal marker. This happened. That moment binds emotion to behavior. It tells the brain the data matters. Many people sabotage the evidence engine by evaluating performance. They ask whether the action was good enough, productive enough, or meaningful enough. This redirects attention to outcome. Outcome evaluation introduces judgment. Judgment reintroduces emotion. Emotion reintroduces negotiation. The evidence engine only cares about one binary variable: execution or non-execution. Quality is irrelevant at this stage. Improvement comes later, after identity stabilizes. Another common failure mode is over-recording. People track too many metrics, journal excessively, or analyze progress daily. This increases cognitive load and emotional interference. The system becomes noisy. The evidence engine works best when tracking is minimal and mechanical. The action occurs. It is marked as done. The day ends. Nothing more is required. Over time, the accumulation of evidence produces a shift. The internal narrative changes quietly. Thoughts like "I'm not consistent" lose credibility. They no longer match the data. New thoughts appear without effort. This is just what I do. This is belief change. Importantly, belief change is not felt as a breakthrough. It is felt as normality. The action stops feeling special. Resistance decreases. Motivation becomes unnecessary. People often miss this moment because they are looking for excitement. There is none. The system simply updates. Once identity shifts, the evidence engine can be repurposed. You can increase difficulty, change domains, or stack behaviors. But none of that works until the engine is running cleanly. This chapter clarifies why most people know what to do, but do not believe they will do it. Knowledge without evidence is ignored. Evidence without repetition is discounted. Repetition without explanation is decisive. In the next chapter, we will address the most damaging failure mode of all, allowing zero. You will see why skipping, even occasionally, carries disproportionate cost early on, and how maintaining a non-zero rule protects the evidence engine from collapse. Chapter 10. Why zero is the only real failure. Most people misunderstand failure. They believe failure comes from doing something incorrectly, with low quality, or without enough effort. At the identity level, none of that matters. Failure is not poor execution. Failure is non-execution. The brain does not evaluate your behavior morally. It evaluates it statistically. It tracks what happens and what does not, then updates its prediction model accordingly. When an action occurs, even imperfectly, the system records evidence. When an action does not occur, the system records confirmation. This is why zero carries disproportionate weight. Early in identity change, the system is undecided. It is testing whether the new behavior is real or situational. Every execution argues for change. Every zero argues against it. The brain is conservative. It defaults to the old model unless the new one is proven consistently. A skipped action is not neutral. It actively teaches the brain that resistance correctly predicted non-action. That lesson increases future resistance. The system becomes more confident that avoidance is the correct forecast. This explains a common experience. Someone is consistent for several days or weeks. They miss one day. Immediately, the next day feels heavier. Motivation drops. Doubt appears. The behavior suddenly feels fragile again. This is not psychological weakness. It is model reinforcement. People often misattribute this collapse to guilt, shame, or loss of momentum. Those are surface effects. The deeper cause is that the brain updated its prediction. The new behavior is optional. Optional behaviors are never incorporated into identity. This is why allowing off days too early destroys progress. The brain cannot distinguish between intentional rest and avoidance. Both look identical at the prediction level. Until identity stabilizes, any exception provides explanation that preserves the old model. This does not mean you should ignore physical limits or real constraints. It means the action must be designed to survive those constraints. If your system requires rest days, it is overbuilt. If it cannot compress under pressure, it is fragile. The non-zero rule solves this. The rule is simple. Action always occurs, but size is adjustable. When energy is low, the action shrinks. When time is scarce, the action compresses. When resistance is high, the action becomes minimal, but it never disappears. This eliminates the daily negotiation of whether to act. The decision is already made. Only the dosage changes. Many people fear that minimum execution will lead to stagnation. They worry they will do the bare minimum forever. This fear misunderstands the system. Identity updates from frequency, not intensity. Once action becomes predicted, effort naturally increases without pressure. Another common mistake is trying to compensate for zero with intensity. People miss a day and then double their effort later. This fails because identity does not average behavior. It updates sequentially. A zero today is not erased by effort tomorrow. The system asks one question each day: did the behavior occur or not? This is why streaks matter early on, not because they are motivational, but because they prevent explanation. A clean sequence leaves the brain no way to dismiss the pattern. Zero also provides emotional relief. That relief is the reward that trains avoidance. Each time zero is allowed, the system learns that discomfort leads to escape. This is how procrastination becomes entrenched. Eliminating zero breaks this association. Discomfort no longer predicts relief. It predicts action, even if small. Once identity has shifted and action is predicted reliably, the cost of zero decreases. At that point, flexibility becomes possible. Before that, flexibility is indistinguishable from self-sabotage. This chapter removes the most common leak in behavior change systems. You do not need more effort. You need fewer exceptions. In the next chapter, we will remove another destabilizing factor: emotional evaluation. You will see why treating feelings as data rather than directives creates calm consistency, and why emotional neutrality dramatically increases long-term output. Chapter 11. Emotional neutrality as a performance advantage. Most people believe strong emotion is required for meaningful action. They assume passion drives consistency, and that emotional engagement is a sign of commitment. This belief is not just wrong, it is destabilizing. Emotion is information, not instruction. When emotion is allowed to participate in decision-making, behavior becomes volatile. When emotion is observed but excluded from authority, behavior becomes stable. Emotional neutrality is not apathy, it is role clarity. The problem is not that people feel too much. The problem is that they consult feelings as if feelings were criteria. Every time you ask, "Do I feel like doing this?" you are delegating execution to a variable that fluctuates hourly. The brain recognizes this. It learns that emotion has veto power. Resistance increases accordingly. People who perform consistently are not emotionally numb. They feel boredom, doubt, frustration, and fatigue like everyone else. The difference is that those states are not part of the decision loop. They are side effects, not signals. This is why emotional neutrality is a performance advantage. When action is decoupled from emotional evaluation, three things happen immediately. First, cognitive load drops. You no longer waste energy interpreting internal states. There is no inner debate to resolve. The system moves from deliberation to execution. Second, resistance loses leverage. Resistance relies on emotion to communicate urgency. When emotion is no longer consulted, resistance becomes background noise. Third, recovery accelerates. Emotional volatility prolongs stress. Neutrality shortens it. The nervous system stabilizes faster when feelings are not escalated into narratives. Most people unknowingly sabotage themselves by monitoring how they feel during action. They ask whether they are enjoying it, whether it feels meaningful, or whether it is working. These evaluations pull emotion back into the system and reactivate negotiation. This is especially damaging early on. Identity change requires a clean signal. Emotional commentary contaminates that signal. Neutrality keeps the signal clean. There is also a misconception that removing emotion will reduce quality. People fear they will produce mediocre work if they are not emotionally invested. This fear misunderstands sequencing. Quality is not the input, it is the output. Quality improves after repetition, stabilizes identity. Before that point, emotional investment increases variance, not excellence. Calm repetition produces higher long-term performance. Another important point is that emotional neutrality protects against burnout. Burnout is not caused by effort. It is caused by emotional friction. When every action is evaluated emotionally, effort feels heavier than it is. Neutral execution reduces perceived cost. This is why professionals outlast amateurs. Professionals do not rely on feeling inspired. They rely on procedure. Emotion is present but irrelevant. Neutrality also changes how feedback is processed. When emotion is minimized, feedback is received as data rather than judgment. This accelerates learning and reduces defensiveness. Many people believe neutrality must be trained through mindset work or detachment practices. That is unnecessary. Neutrality emerges automatically when the system is designed correctly. When actions are small, bounded, and predictable, emotion naturally quiets. The brain no longer interprets action as threat. Feelings soften on their own. It is important to clarify that emotional neutrality does not mean suppressing emotion. Suppression increases internal conflict. Neutrality means allowing emotion to exist without assigning it meaning. Boredom is allowed. Discomfort is allowed. Doubt is allowed. None of them are consulted. This is a subtle but critical distinction. Over time, this approach produces a noticeable shift. Action feels lighter. Days feel less dramatic. Progress becomes quiet and reliable. People often misinterpret this as loss of passion. In reality, it is loss of volatility. Passion that depends on emotion burns out. Passion that emerges from identity alignment is sustainable. This chapter reframes emotion from fuel to friction. When emotion is removed from the role of decision-maker, performance becomes boring, consistent, and effective. In the next chapter, we will examine what happens under stress. You will see why chaos reveals true identity, why most systems collapse during disruption, and how to design execution that survives bad days, uncertainty, and pressure without regression. Chapter 12. Stress, Chaos, and Identity Regression. Stress does not create new behavior. It reveals what is already installed. When conditions are calm, many systems appear to work. When pressure increases, those systems collapse. This is not because stress is destructive. It is because stress removes buffers and exposes the true prediction model underneath. This is why people often say, "I was doing fine until life got busy." Life did not cause the regression. Life removed the conditions that were temporarily supporting behavior. Under stress, the brain shifts priorities. It conserves energy, narrows focus, and reverts to the most reliable patterns available. This is not weakness, it is efficiency. If your execution system depends on time availability, emotional stability, or low uncertainty, stress will break it. Stress reveals whether behavior is identity-based or condition-based. Identity-based behavior survives chaos. Condition-based behavior does not. This is why discipline built on motivation or willpower evaporates during disruption. Those mechanisms require surplus resources. Stress removes surplus. Regression under stress feels personal. People interpret it as failure. In reality, it is diagnostic. It tells you exactly what was never installed. This is why stress is useful. Stress shows you which behaviors are truly part of identity and which were being propped up by circumstance. The mistake is responding emotionally to regression instead of structurally. Most people respond to stress-induced regression in one of two ways. They either give up entirely or attempt to compensate with intensity. Both responses reinforce fragility. Giving up confirms the old identity. Overcompensating increases cost, which makes future execution less likely. The correct response is compression, not escalation. When stress increases, actions must shrink. This is not lowering standards. It is preserving identity evidence under chaos. The goal is not progress. The goal is continuity. Continuity keeps the evidence engine running. It tells the brain that action still occurs, even when conditions are unfavorable. This is powerful data. Many people mistakenly believe they should pause systems during hard periods. Pausing feels responsible. At the identity level, pausing is indistinguishable from abandonment. If action stops during stress, the brain learns that the behavior is conditional on ease. Identity does not update. This is why the non-zero rule becomes even more important during disruption. The action may be trivial. It may feel almost meaningless. That is irrelevant. Its function is to preserve prediction. Another critical factor is self-talk during regression. People often narrate failure. They say things like, "I've fallen off," or "I lost momentum." These narratives bind emotion to the regression and amplify its effect. The system does not need interpretation. It needs correction. Correction under stress means returning to the smallest executable version of the action immediately, without explanation or judgment. Stress also exposes over-complex systems. If your routine requires multiple steps, specific environments, or extended time blocks, stress will dismantle it. Simplicity is not laziness, it is robustness. Robust systems survive chaos by design. This chapter also clarifies an important truth. Identity change is not proven on good days. It is proven on bad ones. Anyone can act when conditions are favorable. Identity is defined by what happens when they are not. This is why chaotic periods often precede breakthroughs. They force the system to either stabilize or collapse. If continuity is maintained, identity locks in. People who appear resilient are not emotionally stronger. They are structurally simpler. Their systems degrade gracefully instead of failing completely. Once identity is stable, stress no longer causes regression. It may reduce output, but execution remains intact. The system bends, then returns. This is the difference between fragile progress and durable change. In the next chapter, we will discuss how to scale difficulty without breaking consistency. You will learn when to increase load, when to hold steady, and why premature scaling is one of the most common ways people destroy otherwise functional systems. Chapter 13. Scaling difficulty without breaking consistency. Once execution becomes stable, a new problem appears. Not lack of motivation, not resistance, not inconsistency, but premature scaling. This is where many systems that were finally working collapse. People feel progress and assume the correct response is to do more. They increase volume, intensity, complexity, or scope. They confuse stability with capacity. The brain does not. Consistency is fragile during early identity change. Scaling too quickly reintroduces threat, explanation, and resistance. The system does not care that you are doing better. It only cares whether prediction remains accurate. Scaling is not about ambition. It is about timing. The brain updates identity conservatively. Once it begins to predict action reliably, it still monitors cost. If cost increases too quickly, resistance returns. Not because the identity is gone, but because the system is reassessing. This is where most people misinterpret signals. They feel resistance and assume something is wrong with them. Or worse, they assume the method has stopped working. In reality, they violated a structural rule. Scale must lag identity. Identity sets the ceiling. Scaling tests it. If scaling exceeds identity, the system pushes back. This explains why people can maintain small routines effortlessly, but struggle the moment they step it up. The issue is not effort tolerance, it is prediction mismatch. The correct approach to scaling is incremental and asymmetrical. Incremental means increases are small enough that the brain does not register threat. Asymmetrical means increases happen in one dimension at a time. Most people scale symmetrically. They add time, difficulty, frequency, and complexity simultaneously. This multiplies perceived cost. Resistance spikes. Instead, only one variable should change at once. If time increases, difficulty stays constant. If difficulty increases, time stays constant. If complexity increases, frequency stays constant. This keeps the system within prediction tolerance. Another critical rule is proof before expansion. Do not scale because you feel capable. Feelings are unreliable. Scale only after the system has produced evidence over time. Evidence means execution has occurred without resistance spikes, negotiation, or emotional volatility. The system must feel boring before it is safe to scale. Boredom indicates that identity has incorporated the behavior. Emotional neutrality has set in. The action no longer feels like a project. It feels like maintenance. This is the correct moment to scale. Even then, scaling should feel slightly underwhelming. If the increase feels exciting, it is probably too large. Excitement is emotional explanation. Explanation delays identity update. Another common mistake is scaling to optimize. People introduce tools, metrics, or refinements too early. Optimization increases cognitive load. Cognitive load increases emotional involvement. Emotional involvement increases fragility. Optimization belongs after identity stabilizes at the higher load, not before. There is also a difference between scaling volume and scaling difficulty. Scaling volume extends duration or frequency. Scaling difficulty increases challenge within the same duration. Volume is safer early on. Difficulty introduces uncertainty and requires more prediction adjustment. When in doubt, scale volume before difficulty. Another overlooked factor is recovery identity. As load increases, recovery becomes part of the system. If recovery is not operationalized, fatigue accumulates and is misinterpreted as resistance. The system regresses. Recovery must be procedural, not emotional. It cannot depend on feeling tired. It must be scheduled and bounded like action. This maintains predictability. Scaling also exposes hidden identity conflicts. As actions take up more space in life, they may threaten other identities. The brain resists not because of effort, but because of perceived trade-offs. This is why some people sabotage success unconsciously. The system predicts loss in another domain and intervenes. Scaling must therefore respect identity compatibility. Expanding one behavior should not require violating another identity too abruptly. When it does, resistance appears. The solution is sequencing, not force. One identity stabilizes before another is challenged. Scaling is also where ego becomes dangerous. People want to prove something. Proof-seeking increases intensity. Intensity increases explanation. Explanation prevents identity update. The system does not care about proof. It cares about pattern. If scaling breaks consistency, it was premature. The correct response is not to push harder. It is to scale back slightly and hold until stability returns. This is not failure, it is calibration. Proper scaling feels almost boringly cautious. That is why most people skip it. They prefer dramatic leaps. Dramatic leaps feel meaningful. They also collapse. Inevitability is built through restraint. When scaling is done correctly, the experience is subtle. There is no internal announcement. One day you realize you are doing more without effort. That is identity expanding. Once scaling becomes predictable, you can repeat the process across domains. The same principles apply. Identity sets the pace. Evidence leads. Scaling follows. This chapter exists to prevent self-sabotage disguised as ambition. In the next chapter, we will apply this entire system across concrete domains: business, body, and skill acquisition. You will see how the same causal structure produces different outcomes and why inevitability transfers once the mechanism is understood. Chapter 14. One system, many outcomes. Most people compartmentalize their lives. They believe business requires one kind of discipline, health another, and learning a third. This belief is convenient and wrong. The domains differ. The mechanism does not. Human behavior runs on a single causal system. Identity predicts action. Action generates evidence. Evidence updates identity. The surface variables change, but the structure remains fixed. This chapter exists to remove a final illusion that you need different strategies for different goals. You do not. You need one system that produces inevitability. Then you apply it wherever you choose. The mistake people make is importing outcomes across domains instead of importing inputs. They see someone succeed in business and assume confidence or ambition caused it. They see someone in great physical shape and assume motivation or genetics. They see someone master a skill and assume talent or intelligence. What they are actually observing is identity alignment expressed in different environments. Once you understand this, transfer becomes obvious. In work and business, inconsistency rarely comes from lack of ideas or intelligence. It comes from identity rules that make execution conditional. People tell themselves they work best under pressure, need clarity before starting, or only focus when things are urgent. These rules produce sporadic output and last-minute effort. The system is stable even if the results are not ideal. When people try to fix this with tools, planning systems, or motivation, nothing changes because the identity rule remains intact. The system must be applied at the input level. A small, time-bounded action performed daily, regardless of quality, generates contradictory evidence. Work occurs without pressure. Clarity appears after action, not before. Over time, the identity shifts from reacting to urgency to executing predictably. Business results follow as a consequence, not a target. In the body and physical domain, the same error appears in a different form. People associate progress with intensity. They train hard, burn out, stop, then restart later. The identity becomes someone who exercises in cycles. This pattern feels familiar, so it persists. The body adapts to frequency, not punishment. The nervous system adapts to predictability, not heroics. When movement occurs daily at a level that does not require emotional preparation, resistance fades. The body begins to expect activity. Capacity increases quietly. Intensity becomes useful only after identity stabilizes. Before that, it is a liability. This is why people who claim to hate exercise can become consistent without ever enjoying it. Enjoyment was never required. Identity alignment was. Learning exposes another version of the same system. Many people believe they are either good learners or not. This belief forms early and becomes self-reinforcing. They wait to understand before acting, and because they do not act, understanding never arrives. The identity rule here is that clarity must precede effort. This rule guarantees stagnation. Learning actually works in reverse. Exposure precedes clarity. Repetition precedes confidence. Action produces comprehension. When small, regular learning actions occur, regardless of confusion, the brain updates its prediction. Learning stops feeling threatening. Progress accelerates without force. What looked like a talent gap reveals itself as an identity constraint. Across all domains, the same structure applies. Small, repeatable actions generate evidence. Evidence shifts identity. Identity predicts behavior. Outcomes follow automatically. This is why success in one area often spills into others. Once the system is installed, it transfers. The brain learns a new rule. Action does not depend on internal state. The specifics change. The mechanism does not. This chapter completes the generalization. From here on, the remaining chapters focus on removing the final leaks in the system and stabilizing execution long term. In the next chapter, we will dismantle the idea of laziness entirely. You will see why labeling yourself as lazy preserves the wrong identity, and how removing that label eliminates one of the last psychological barriers to inevitability. Chapter 15. You are not lazy. Laziness is not a trait. It is a label applied after behavior has already been explained incorrectly. When people call themselves lazy, they believe they have identified the cause of their inconsistency. In reality, they have named the outcome and mistaken it for an explanation. This mistake is damaging because it freezes the system instead of correcting it. The brain does not generate behavior based on moral qualities. It generates behavior based on prediction and energy efficiency. Laziness is not a mechanism. It explains nothing operationally. What people describe as laziness is always one of three things: identity-preserving avoidance, prediction-based energy conservation, or poorly designed systems. None of these are flaws. All of them are solvable. The label lazy feels accurate because it is emotionally charged. It carries shame. Shame feels like accountability, but shame does not produce evidence. It produces threat. Threat pushes the system back into preservation mode. This is why self-criticism makes behavior worse. When you label yourself as lazy, you are not motivating change. You are reinforcing an identity that predicts non-action. The brain hears the label and updates its model accordingly. This is who I am. Resistance increases, execution decreases, the label becomes true. This is a closed loop. People often say, I know I'm lazy, I just need to push harder. This creates a contradiction. They are trying to override an identity while reinforcing it verbally. The system resolves the contradiction by maintaining behavior and increasing internal conflict. No behavior system can function under self-attack. Another misconception is that laziness explains inconsistency. It does not. If laziness were the cause, behavior would be uniformly low across all contexts. That is never the case. People who call themselves lazy can work intensely under deadlines, emergencies, or external pressure. They can focus on things they care about. They can exert effort when identity allows it. This immediately disproves laziness as a trait. What is actually happening is conditional execution. Action occurs when the identity prediction changes due to context. Pressure temporarily overrides the baseline model. Remove the pressure and behavior reverts. The correct conclusion is not, I am lazy. The correct conclusion is, my system only predicts action under specific conditions. That is a design problem, not a character flaw. Laziness is also often confused with energy depletion. Modern environments fragment attention, overload cognition, and produce constant low-grade stress. The brain adapts by conserving energy aggressively. Avoidance is interpreted as laziness. It is actually regulation. Blaming yourself for this response adds threat to an already taxed system. Threat further reduces capacity. Avoidance increases. The cycle tightens. This is why people feel stuck. The removal of the laziness label is not about self-compassion. It is about accuracy. Accurate diagnosis is required for effective intervention. Once laziness is removed from the model, the real levers become visible. You stop asking, why can't I force myself? You start asking, what identity prediction is blocking this action? You stop asking, what's wrong with me? You start asking, what evidence has my system accumulated? This shift alone reduces resistance. Another reason the laziness label persists is that it excuses poor system design. If you believe the problem is you never question the structure of your actions. You attempt to change internal states instead of redesigning inputs. People say they are lazy when the action is too large, too vague, too emotionally loaded, or too dependent on ideal conditions. The system correctly predicts failure and resists. The person blames themselves. This is backwards. A well-designed system produces action even when energy is low. A poorly designed one requires constant force. Laziness is what you call the experience of running a bad system. This chapter also addresses a deeper issue: identity safety. For some people, the label lazy is familiar. It provides explanation. Letting go of it creates uncertainty. If you are not lazy, then the system must change. That responsibility feels heavier than the shame, so the brain preserves the label. This is why simply telling yourself, "I'm not lazy," does nothing. Identity does not change through reassurance. It changes through new evidence. The goal is not to replace "I'm lazy" with "I'm disciplined." That is another evaluative identity. The goal is to remove evaluative identity entirely and replace it with procedural identity. You are not lazy. You are someone whose system predicts avoidance under certain conditions. That statement creates room for engineering. When you stop moralizing behavior, execution becomes easier. There is no need to prove worth. There is no identity to defend. There is only a system to adjust. This neutrality is powerful. Once the laziness narrative collapses, resistance loses emotional charge. Avoidance stops feeling like failure and starts feeling like data. Data can be used. This chapter removes one of the last internal obstacles to inevitability. As long as you believe the problem is you will keep trying to fix yourself. There is nothing to fix. There is only a system to install. In the final chapter, we will assemble everything into a long-term structure, not a challenge, not a phase, a way of operating where execution no longer depends on motivation, self-image, or emotional state, a life that runs without negotiation. Chapter 16. Building a life that runs without motivation. At this point, the mechanism should be clear. Action becomes reliable not when you feel different, but when the system no longer asks how you feel. Motivation disappears from the decision loop, and with it, volatility. This final chapter is not about adding new tools. It is about locking the system in place so regression becomes unlikely and self-correcting. Most people think long-term consistency requires constant vigilance. They imagine discipline as something that must be renewed daily. That belief is a holdover from motivation-based models. Systems that work do not require monitoring, they require maintenance. A life that runs without motivation is built on a small number of non-negotiable procedures. These procedures are not inspiring, they are boring, predictable, and reliable. That is why they work. The core principle is simple. Execution must be the default, not the decision. When behavior is defaulted, the brain stops spending energy evaluating it. Evaluation is where emotion enters. Removing evaluation removes instability. This is why routines matter only when they are procedural, not aspirational. A routine that requires enthusiasm will fail. A routine that triggers automatically will persist. Long-term stability also requires containment. Each domain should have a clearly defined action that represents enough. Without containment, ambition creeps in. Ambition increases load. Increased load invites resistance. Containment protects identity. Another requirement is periodic evidence refresh. Identity, once updated, is stable but not permanent. Long gaps without evidence allow old predictions to resurface. This does not mean you must constantly push. It means the non-zero rule must remain in place indefinitely. People often ask when they can relax. The answer is when execution no longer feels like something you do, but like something that happens. At that point, relaxation is built in. A life without motivation also requires accepting emotional neutrality as normal. Many people misinterpret calm consistency as stagnation. They crave emotional highs as proof of progress. This craving reintroduces volatility. Progress feels quiet when it is real. Another important factor is environment. Systems do not exist in isolation. Physical and social environments either reduce or increase friction. A motivation-free life minimizes friction proactively. Tools are accessible. Triggers are obvious. Distractions are constrained. This is not optimization. It is friction management. Over time, the system produces a noticeable shift in self-perception. You stop identifying as someone who struggles to be consistent. You also stop identifying as someone who is disciplined. Both labels become irrelevant. You are simply someone who executes. This is the most stable identity possible. When identity stabilizes this way, motivation may return occasionally. When it does, it feels like excess energy, not a requirement. You can use it or ignore it. The system does not depend on it. This is the final inversion. Motivation becomes optional. Execution becomes inevitable. At this stage, outcomes begin to accumulate in multiple domains. Health improves. Work compounds. Skills develop. None of this feels dramatic internally. From the outside, it may look impressive. From the inside, it feels normal. This is how inevitability feels. Unremarkable. There is one final rule to remember. Systems drift when they are not respected. If you begin to negotiate again, if you allow zero to creep back in, if you start consulting emotion as authority, the system will degrade. But degradation is now detectable early. You will feel it as friction returning. That friction is a signal, not a failure. The response is always the same. Return to minimum execution and restore the pattern. No self-judgment, no reset rituals, no motivation seeking, just action. This book does not promise that life will become easy. It promises that action will become predictable. Predictability is more powerful than ease. It removes uncertainty. It collapses probability into outcome. You do not need motivation. You do not need confidence. You do not need to believe in yourself. You need a system that makes execution inevitable. Once that system is installed, the rest follows on its own. Action is the only interface with reality.